Today's guest is a New York Times bestselling author and an award-winning tabletop RPG designer. Please stick around for this episode.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the show where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players. After this interview is over today, you are going to want to go to DiceGeeks.com and check out the show notes, because my guest today has written numerous novels. He has designed many tabletop RPGs, and there will be links to as many of those as I can get together in the show notes, so you can check them all out. And so I am just so excited about this episode today that we're not going to waste any more time. Here's the interview. My guest today is New York Times bestselling author with more than 30 books to his credit. He is an award-winning game designer whose work is featured in products for Wizards of the Coast, Games Workshop, TSR, Decipher, White Wolf, Pinnacle, Green Ronin, and that is not to even mention his work in comic books and video games. Matt Forbeck. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I think this is actually the first time in my life that I have actually talked to a New York Times bestselling author. So,
Ask my kids, the thrill wears off quickly. It's okay.
Okay, I'm sure. Just to start off, does it make you sick to your stomach when guys like me call themselves writers?
No, hell no. Are you kidding me? Why would I feel that way? No. For Christ's sake. You know, it's, if you sit down and you try to write, you're a writer, right? Okay. The only difference is that if you get published, then you're a published writer. If somebody pays you, then you're a professional writer, right? Okay. There are distinctions that are made, but these are adjectives that you add on to the title writer. If you call yourself a writer and you're actually working at it, then more power to you. Why would I be sickened by that?
Well, I just wanted to make sure. No.
It's, if you're a game designer, if you're a writer, if you're a gamer, whatever, these should be inclusive labels. We should broaden them out as widely as we can. And then if we want to make distinctions between people for whatever reason, we can do that. But I think there's no reason to exclude people just on the basis of what they're doing or what they're dreaming to do.
Okay. No, that's good to hear. Now, just kind of following up with that a little bit, nowadays anybody can publish a book or publish a tabletop RPG. Sure. What's your opinion on the self-publishing revolution?
I think it's great. I've done some hybrid publishing myself and for my novels. And, I used to run a publishing company called Pinnacle Entertainment Group, which is still going. I founded it with Shane Hensley back in 96, I believe, 95, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I ran it as a president for 4 years, and Shane was the CEO. Mm-hmm. Technically we were self-publishing, even though it was a company and it looks like we're all professional and we had booths and shows and stuff, but we were publishing our own stuff, right? It wasn't like we went out and found other people and published their games. We published our games. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's anything wrong with self-publishing. I think it's great that it's a lot easier to do now, right? You don't have to print books. You can do PDFs. You can do ebooks. You can do these things. You can do print on demand. And the risk to the individual creator is much less than it used to be because of that. It used to be you had to, mortgage your house or tap your friends and family for money to be able to publish these things. Mm-hmm. And if you blew it, you weren't very welcome on Thanksgiving anymore, right? But nowadays, you can do these things for relatively little risk outside of your own time and effort. And, that's wonderful. It means we get all sorts of things that we probably wouldn't have seen before.
Do you think actually like storytelling or the way like the game markets and stuff is changing just because now almost anybody can publish a game?
Yeah, I think so. I think you have less in the way of gatekeepers. And, gatekeepers, when it comes to publishing, are like editors and publishers and stuff like that. They're not a bad thing. They're arbiters of quality in a lot of ways, right? Mm-hmm. But they're people who are, by necessity, looking for things that will sell to a very large audience, mm-hmm. right? They want to be able to put out a book and sell it to, thousands, if not tens, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And they're not really looking at little niche passion products because of that. They want to be able to, keep the lights on wherever they are. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it means that these individual publishers then, or individual creators, can take risks that a larger publisher wouldn't. For instance, there's this whole new genre of fiction called lit RPG, which are basically people writing stories as if they were in the game themselves. And, you actually see the game mechanics and everything else happens. This books I write for publishers, that kind of stuff is forbidden, right? Yeah. Nobody would do that. You would never let somebody hear the dice rattling in the background. You want to hear the story as opposed to the mechanics. But some of these people, these creators coming up said, hey, I like the game. I like the mechanics. I want to put that in the forefront of this. I want it to be part of the story. And I think that's kind of amazing because I don't think that would have happened without individuals coming up with that stuff, right? I don't think a publisher would have stepped up and said, kids these days understand mechanics. Let's put it in a game, right? It's so that's an example of something that came out that I don't think would have been done by traditional publishing.
I actually have a story about that, even in my limited experience. Probably around 2000, I was sending out some short stories, and an editor wrote back to me and said, it reads like a tabletop RPG. We can't publish it. And
exactly.
Now I'm kind of kicking myself, right? I probably should have kept writing that stuff. But
well, you could have, but you don't know. I mean, the trouble is that back in 2000, maybe the audience wasn't ready for it, right?
Yeah.
Now it's 19 years later or 18 years later or whatever, and to be able to say that we have a whole new group of people, readers, gamers, whatever, that have different expectations of what they read and what they digest. That's amazing, right? It's just a matter of timing more than anything else. You could go back to that stuff now and maybe resurrect it.
Yeah, maybe I will. What would be your advice if somebody has kind of been kicking around some ideas for novels or tabletop RPGs for a while? I'm asking for a friend, of course, but what if they've been kicking around these ideas for a while, but they just can't seem to, kind of get them on paper or kind of get to the next step? What would your advice be?
Well, the general advice I have for any writer is to plant your in a chair and type, right? Yeah. Just because actually working on the project is much more effective than thinking about the project. And that's not casting aspersions on anybody. Everybody's got their own lives and their own restrictions, their own problems, their own other things they're dealing with. So it's not always possible to do that, right? But when you can, sit down and actually work on these things and put them to paper or to a Word document or a Google Doc or whatever the hell you're working on, just so you have something there. Because there's a vast difference between the idea that's in your head and what actually you can turn into words on paper or in a doc. And until you actually do that, they're just these ephemeral dreams, and you need to nail them down to something. And I think one of the best ways to start if you're having problems is to try to outline what you're doing. For me, this works very well. But there's often people say there's two different types of writers. You have people who do it by the seat of their pants, then you have people who do an outline. They plot everything out. I tend to be very much in the middle, where I do a very, very loose outline. That's maybe a couple sentences per chapter, and then use that as a guide, almost a poorly drawn map for myself before I start going. But at least that means I know where I'm going, what the general outline of what I want to produce is, right? And I think that's helpful for me, at least in a lot of ways.
When did your interest in tabletop RPGs begin?
Well, I started playing pretty young. I was, I think, 12 years old, and my buddy across the street, his mother bought him a copy of the blue box of Dungeons and Dragons, the blue book rules of Dungeons and Dragons at Kmart on a blue light special, right? And his mother and my mother got together and said, "You kids really ought to do something. How about you play this crazy game that Bonnie bought for Mike?" And I'm like, "Okay, sure, we'll play that." And I had no idea, and we kind of around, didn't do anything until the summer. That summer we started playing after school was out, and man, we played every day that summer. It feels like, we'd go play baseball in the afternoons and then D&D in the evenings, and just had a fantastic time. Kind of this idyllic Wisconsin upbringing. This kind of hooked me on very early. Fortunately, I grew up in southern Wisconsin, which is the birthplace of tabletop role-playing games. They all started in a little town called Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Or at least that's where TSR, the first role-playing game publisher, was. That was founded by Gary Gygax and his buddies. And I often tell people that if I'd grown up in L.A., I'd have probably gotten into film. If I'd grown up in New York, I'd have gotten into traditional book publishing. But because I grew up in southern Wisconsin, which was a long way from both those things, I got into the creative industry that happened to be here, which was tabletop games. And, I used to play test games in the evening for a company called Pacesetter, which was by a whole bunch of ex-TSR employees back when I was 15, 16 years old. And, some of those guys that I did that with are my peers to this day, right? Troy Denning and Steve Sullivan and et cetera, et cetera. And they've been friends of mine for literally decades at this point. So that always helps.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. So I'm guessing from your experience that you've run a lot of games, obviously. And a couple, yeah. And my audience is made up of a lot of game masters and a lot of people who are trying to get better at running games. And first, I guess, just for the person who is maybe, they haven't run a game yet, or maybe they've only run 1 or 2 sessions, what would you say to a person like that? But they want to run more games.
Right. I think preparation really helps, knowing what you're doing going in there, especially when you're starting out. If you're a noob, walking in there not knowing the rules, or you don't know where you want to go with the story and all that kind of stuff, and you don't know your players that you're playing with, that can be very challenging, right? Mm-hmm. So a little bit of preparation goes a long way to helping build your confidence. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be something where you plan it out to the actual letter and the seconds and the moments and anything like that. But you should at least have the background in your head and feel very comfortable with it and have played through the rules a few times. Mm-hmm. The other thing I could say is, start out at home if you can with friends of yours and people that like you, right? And it's a lot easier to run a game for people who are not being hostile with you or they haven't paid, $10 each to sit down at a table with you at a convention. Sure. But just friends that are sitting around a table, having a pizza and relaxing in the evening and are interested in seeing you succeed, right? Mm-hmm. So if you could get them to be rooting for you at the same time that you're trying to show them a good time, I think having everybody on the same page like that is wonderful.
Now, what about the person who's maybe played, run a lot of games, but they feel that they're either stuck or that they're just not improving or that they have, they kind of making the same mistakes over and over again? What would you say to somebody like that?
Well, I mean, I would try something else. Right? Nobody's forcing you to play games. If it turns out that it's like work and you don't like it anymore, do something else. Play a game instead. Switch to board games for a while. Switch to video games. Read a book. Get outside and do some exercise. Whatever. This whole thing is meant to be fun, right? For everybody involved. And if you're not enjoying it for whatever reason, then I think honestly, just taking a break and doing something else for a little bit before you come back to it can be very refreshing for people, right?
Yeah,
because I think what happens sometimes is you get tunnel vision where you're like going, it has to be like this. And, no, it doesn't have to be like that. Let the players that you're working with define how the game's going to come up and how it's going to be played alongside with you. And I think that'll work a lot better for everybody, right? And if the group that you're playing with right now isn't working for you for some reason, you might try finding another group or doing a little bit on the side with a different group or maybe with a subset of the group that you're working with currently, right? Mm-hmm. And, as you get older, it gets harder and harder to get friends together to do something. So maybe instead of saying we need to have all 6 of us together or whatever, maybe you just say, okay, can any 3 of us get together at any point? Can we do a one-on-one session at any point? And maybe in those one-on-one sessions, you can be a little bit more adventurous with what you're doing and try a little bit more experimental and try things out that you might not try out with the whole group and see how they work, right? Yeah. And take feedback from your players. And you don't really need to have like you don't have to have a form, like it's not a college class where you're being evaluated as a professor at the end of it or anything like that, right? The feedback you look for is, are people enjoying themselves? And if you're running these games and you're in the same room with them, you ought to be able to tell that. Just, are they laughing? Are they having fun? Are they engaged? Are they looking at their phone instead? Are they wandering off at every second? Maybe those are indicative of the point that you're not keeping their attention very well. Mm-hmm. Some people have other reasons their attention is gone. They're busy, they're having relationship problems, their job sucks, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. You can't control that. But hopefully you know the people well enough, you can ask them what's going on if their attention tends to wander that way.
Yeah. Okay. Should a game master know something about storytelling?
I think, yeah. I mean, actually, just about every published fantasy writer I talk to nowadays is somebody who started out in games, believe it or not.
Yeah.
I mean, most of them started out as game players as kids, sometimes game masters as well. Mm-hmm. And I think role-playing games in particular are really good at teaching storytelling techniques and allowing you to become more open to the possibilities, to let the characters talk to you as opposed to trying to force them down a path. And that's one of the good things about games is that, you can't force your players to do things, right? If you're the game master, you can point them in the right direction, what you think is the right direction, and they're generally going to go perpendicular to whatever the heck you had planned. And it's kind of instructive that way to then say, okay, if I have these characters I've come up with, are they going to be going in the direction I envisioned, or are they going to come up with their own ideas? Let that part of your subconscious you use to devise these guys tell you different ways they can go off and do different things. Be open to new ideas that way. I think that's very helpful.
Okay. Yeah. And actually, as I'm doing more interviews for the podcast and I'm interviewing authors, most of them say that they started with D&D when they were in high school or something, or before.
Yeah, it's kind of phenomenal. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And even just reading articles too, there are screenwriters like, I think John August, one of the biggest screenwriters in Hollywood, says he played all, while he was growing up and everything. I mean, I think it's just amazing to see how the tabletop gaming or running those games then informs their career choice, or and informs them as a creator. I just think that's interesting.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of friends in Hollywood nowadays who are working writers, and they still play games, right? I mean, they get together and have game night every week in a lot of cases. And I think that's fantastic, because I think part of it is it keeps them fresh. They're not, again, looking at forcing everything the same way. It's great to get together with other really creative people and see what the hell they come up with as they're riffing off each other.
Sure.
And it's just a lot of fun to be able to do. I mean, if you're a creative person, this is a natural kind of pastime or a hobby for you, whether or not you're doing it for a living or not.
I guess when you approach game design, I don't know if this is too broad of a question. Like, if you have an idea, how do you know it's a game that's like different enough from what's out there or something like that? I mean, I don't know if I'm asking that question right. Or not.
Sure. Well, I mean, part of that, if you want to know if it's unique enough for other people to want to pay attention to it, part of that is knowing what else is out there in the market, what other people are playing, what they're doing. That's honestly these days almost impossible for somebody unless you're a really hardcore gamer, right? But I mean, the number of people who step up and say, this is just like Dungeons and Dragons, except it's got this, right? That's not unique enough in most cases, right?
Yeah.
Because there are people who have been doing that same kind of thing for nearly 40 or over 40 years now, 45 years.
Yeah.
So, that maybe if that's your idea, then maybe you need to do some research and figure it out, right? Talk to other people who are doing this kind of stuff. Go and look at the DMs Guild online, just so you can see what other people are publishing for 5th edition these days, for instance, and come up with your own ideas. The trick is you're never going to be able to know this for sure. So first thing you do is start writing stuff down, then you show it to people, and probably one of your friends or some guy online or whatever is going to say, yeah, that's just like this. And you go, oh. And then you go look at that thing, whatever it is, and you try to decide, all right, am I trying to reinvent a wheel that somebody has already made, right? Or if I got something actually that's a different angle on this than what's already out there, maybe I can play up the differences as opposed to having to scrap all this stuff.
What do you like to see in a game?
Yeah, for me as a game designer, and I started out as a tabletop game designer before I got into doing novels and such. I like to see innovative mechanics. I like to see something that shows me how to do things a little bit differently. Now, all that said, that's what I like to do as a game designer. As a player, I like to have a good group of people to play with. At the end of the day, the rules themselves are not nearly as important as having a good group of players that I enjoy hanging out with. That's one of the reasons it's actually really hard to play test role-playing games, right? Yeah. Because the people you're playing with have such a larger effect upon the game and your enjoyment of it than the rules themselves do. Now, that said, I like to play with rules that encourage the kind of play that we're doing, right? If you're going to play a game that's all about diplomacy and seduction and all that kind of stuff, you want rules that emphasize that as opposed to something that emphasizes combat constantly, right? And I think the rules tell you a lot about what kind of game it's supposed to be, or what the designers had intended for the game. And you should pay attention to that when you're doing it, because otherwise you're working against the grain. You could turn Dungeons and Dragons into a game that's all about foppish lords wandering ballrooms with each other, but that's not really what it's built for, right? It's built for kick down the door, kill the monster, take the loot, right? So, if that's what you want to play, that's great. Play that game. But if you want to play something that's different, then you should look for a game that fits that maybe a little bit better.
Could you kind of let us in on the genesis of Shotguns and Sorcery? Is that your one of your new
Shotguns and Sorcery is a fantasy noir setting that I came up with many years ago. Originally, I did it as an idea for the Dungeons and Dragons World Search they did back in like 2000, 2001. Eventually, it came out that the winner of that contest was Keith Baker, a buddy of mine, who did a game called Eberron, or setting that became Eberron.
Yeah.
And the guys at Wizards had said, let's have everybody just toss in ideas, and I tossed in this one off the top of my head. I'm like, well, I really like that idea. So eventually, I turned around and sold it to a company called Mongoose Publishing, which did a whole bunch of D20 role playing supplements in the world at the time. And I was going to produce it as a game. I think it was called Shadow Knight at the time, which is kind of generic-y fantasy type stuff. But then my wife became pregnant with quadruplets, and that blew everything out of the water. So that kind of tore apart anything I was planning to do on that level for a few years. As you might imagine, and more power to my kids. They were much more important to me than any project I've been working on. And they're all happy and healthy 17-year-olds who are seniors in high school right now. So it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Eventually, as I had this kind of setting in my hip pocket, I just didn't have any use for it until it was Robin Laws, who, world famous game designer Robin Laws, as he's well known, asked me to write a story for this series of anthologies he was doing, a set of anthologies called The New Hero, which were about what he called the iconic hero, which were heroes that, like Batman or Sherlock Holmes or whoever, these classic franchise characters that, when you do a regular story, you do a film or whatever, they always say that you need to have a character arc in which the character discovers something and changes, right?
Yeah.
But Robin's point was that, that's not true for every character. Batman doesn't change that much. He usually comes back to where he was. Superman, Spider-Man, James Bond, Sherlock Holmes, all these long-standing franchise characters often just return to what they are. And he says the point is that they actually don't change. They change the world around them by being true to who they are, right? So he challenged his friends to come up with stories that exemplified that. And I decided to write one for Shotguns and Sorcery called Friends Like These. And that came out several years ago. And then another friend of mine asked for another short story. I said, I'll write another one in that setting. And eventually I got around to the point where I was looking at doing novels with it. So I did this crazy thing called 12 for 12 back in 2012, right? Okay. Where I challenged myself to write a dozen novels in a year. Oh, wow. And they were short novels, about 50,000 words each. But I'm a pretty fast writer, and I was pretty sure I could pull it off. And I broke them up into 4 trilogies, and I ran a Kickstarter for each trilogy. The second of those trilogies was Shotguns and Sorcery, which started out with, it was Hard Times in Dragon City, Bad Times in Dragon City, and End Times in Dragon City. Okay. And those are the 3 Shotguns and Sorcery novels. Okay. And we managed to get it funded, and I went off and wrote them. That year, I didn't write a dozen novels like I was planning to. I wrote 9 novels in that series. I wrote a novel for the TV show Leverage. I wrote 9 issues of Magic the Gathering comic books for IDW. And I wrote a StarCraft 2 novella for Blizzard that they published online and then eventually in print. So I failed, but I failed well. Is what I can say, right?
Well, I would hope for a few of those years as failures. I would like.
Yeah. Well, I say if you set your goals high and you run a little short of them, that's okay, right? If I'd set my goals lower, I might have ended up, doing less even. Sure. So I use those goals as kind of a self-motivation to get me to try to do more stuff. That plus the fact I have, 5 kids to feed along with my wife, who does just as much as I do, mind you. Yeah. But I have to contribute to that. So I have a lot of work that needs to be done. I used to say I kept my mortgage tacked up above my monitor because that was the most motivating thing I could find. Right? Yeah. It comes due every month, whether or not I felt like writing that month or not. But to get back to the Shotguns and Sorcery thing, so I came up with these novels. I did that. Then a guy who I had been paired up to do an enhanced ebook version of these novels with, that folded for some reason. The company folded. And the artist, though, Jeremy Moeller, had his own publishing company called Outland Entertainment. He's like, Matt, I want to do these books with you, but let's do a role-playing game. So he ran a Kickstarter for a role-playing game based on Shotguns and Sorcery. And that finally shipped. It was pretty late. Jeremy had he went through a divorce. He had a lot of crazy stuff going on in his life. Finally got it out the door in the spring. And it's available, though not widely so, right now to the public. So you can go check that out. And he also collected the 3 novels, 2 short stories, and got a fresh short story from me for a Shotguns and Sorcery omnibus that's available through Amazon nowadays and through most booksellers as well.
Okay. I guess could you just explain a little bit fantasy noir, like exactly what that would mean?
Sure. Fantasy noir in this case is it's take your average fantasy world and then advance it. So let's say it's been around for 1,000 years. They often say, oh, this world's been around for thousands of years. And I'm like, man, and they haven't made any advances at all. They don't have, big cities with lights and stuff like that. It seems like you would build that up over a while. So, so in this setting, essentially what has happened, and it gets a bit more complex than that, but 1,000 years ago, there was the necromancer known as the ruler of the dead comes forth and unleashes a zombie horde upon the continent, right? And destroys just about everything, kills off all the major armies, destroys all the countries, with the exception of one area that the free people drive themselves toward, which is known as Dragon Mountain, which is the mountain where the most powerful dragon in the world lives. Okay. And the people who are the survivors cut a deal with the dragon and say, hey, if you will keep the zombies off our back long enough for us to build a wall around the mountain, that would be great. Right? And the dragon says, I will do that as long as you make me emperor of your new kingdom here that you're doing. And I'm going to be in charge of everything. And they do it. So they build up this massive wall around the mountain, and the elves live at the top of the mountain just under the dragon. Then the dwarves live beneath them, and the gnomes live beneath them, then the halflings and the humans. And then the green peoples live right down by the walls. So the orcs, the goblins, the kobolds, whatever that have survived, the ogres, who are looked down upon. So there's this literal stratification of classes throughout of society here going on. They live down by the walls where you can actually hear the zombies still scratching against the outer wall every night. And so it's 1,000 years later, and the main character is a guy named Max Gibson, who's a private detective, ex-adventurer, who gave it up 10 years ago after his last big hit when his best friend was killed in their escape from a dungeon. And he and his friends looked at each other and couldn't stand the sight of each other anymore. So it's got this kind of a dark, noirish feel to it, post-warish kind of a feel to it, where you're living as a detective or as an adventurer underneath the auspices of the Dragon Emperor and the Imperial Dragon's Guard, which are a bunch of jackbooted thug elves that run the entire city for him. So.
Okay. Well, I will be sure to link all of those products up in the show notes for this episode. And then can you tell us about your latest projects? I think it's the Endless Quest books.
Yeah, that's the most recent thing I've had published, although I'm actually doing comic book stuff for Marvel too. But let me get to, I'm writing Conan stories for Marvel, but let me tell you about the Endless Quest books first. Those are pick a path adventures, which are, basically you get to a page and it gives you some choices. And if you want to do one thing, you go to this page. If you want to do this other thing, you go to the other page.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a whole series of them that came out back in the 80s and 90s. There were something like 120, 130 different novels that came out from TSR back in the day.
Yeah, I read a number of those.
Yeah, they were a lot of fun, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And a company I work with called Bonnier Books, and they co-publish with Candlewick in the United States. They came to me a few years ago. They had the license for the ology books. So they published the ology books, which are like spyology, dragonology, Egyptology, etc., ufology. And they had licensed Dungeons and Dragons and wanted to do a book called Dungeonology. So I wrote that for them. Okay. And it was one of these really neat books with like lots of little pop-up bits and extra booklets and stuff, trying to introduce children to the idea of Dungeons and Dragons. And when I say children, I mean young readers, obviously.
Sure.
And that did well enough. They decided to come back to me and say, hey, look, we'd like to do some more of these Endless Quest books. So we had 4 of them come out on September, like Labor Day of last year. Okay. And it did well enough that they asked me to write 2 more. So we had 2 more just come out on September 3rd, just after Labor Day of this year. Oh, okay. And they seem to be doing pretty well. Kids like them. They're fully illustrated, full color all the way throughout. Wow. You will die many, many times in these. There's like 26 different endings in each book, and probably 3/4 of them are miserable deaths, right? Because my philosophy is that if you get to a death ending, you're like, oh, damn. And then you turn back to the page you're at and you make the other choice, right?
Yeah.
And that way you read a lot of the different choices and you get a lot of use out of the book. And you enjoy it many, many times.
Sure.
Whereas if you succeed every time, you're like, okay, I won. And okay, I won. Oh, that was good. That's over. But if you are challenged by it, if it actually presents a challenge to you, I find it to be much more engaging. So, and hopefully the readers do too.
Yeah.
So those came out, like I said, the most recent ones just came out on September 3rd. The other thing I have going on is I'm writing a Conan backup story in, it's called Age of Conan Valyria, which is a mini-series from Marvel Comics. Wow. And they're doing backup prose stories in their comic books these days for Conan stuff. And they hired me on to write a Thoth Amon story. And Thoth Amon is a great Stygian wizard who's Conan's greatest nemesis. And I got to write a little bit about how he went from being the most powerful sorcerer in Stygia to being a slave, which is where we find him trapped in the opening pages of the first ever Conan published story, The Phoenix on the Sword. So I get to do a little prequel to that, and that was kind of fun.
Oh, that's very exciting. Just kind of a follow-up on the Endless Quest books. Is that a different process when you're writing those from when you're writing just like an ordinary novel?
Oh, sure. Yeah. For those, like the outline is the most important thing, right? Yeah. Because originally when they sent me the page plans for the book, they're like, okay, here, just write it like this. I'm like, I don't get this. So I sat down and flow charted everything out. So I actually have a flow chart that shows you where all the decisions are that you make. Mm-hmm. And then I write an outline that tells you what's going to happen for each of these different decision points, these different sets of pages that you write or that you read. And once that's approved, once Wizards and my publisher, my editor say, oh yeah, that looks great, then I go off and write, right? But the real challenge is making sure that all the different story choices line up and are exciting and engaging and fun, right? Mm-hmm. And then I go and write that. And at that point, it's a little bit like writing by numbers because I know what's going to happen in every section.
Yeah.
But the trick is, and the challenge is then to make it as entertaining as possible in each section, right? And especially on those deaths. I don't want somebody to say, oh, I died and that was boring. You want to say, oh man, I died and that was so cool. Right? Then they turn around and go back to some other part of it. And again, the trick is to, not be entertaining just in little bursts here and there, like you might be throughout a regular book where you have some bits where they might slow down here and there. And on a pick a path book like that, an Endless Quest book, every page, every few pages, every section has to be entertaining on its own, right? To draw the reader along and get them excited about where they're going to go next.
Yeah. No, and like I said, I remember reading some of those the TSR ones back from the late '80s and early '90s, and I don't know, they were great. I mean, they just they really inspired me too, because it was on times when I couldn't get a gaming group together. That's what I would read one of those novels or whatever, and it would kind of fill the itch a little bit for D&D.
Yeah, I totally see that, right? I mean, that's part of the point of them is just you can have yourself an adventure by yourself, right? Mm-hmm. And because you can't always get a gaming group together. You can sit down and read one of these instead.
Yeah, no, and that's great. And like I said too, with those, I'll link all of those up in the show notes and everything, and so everybody will be able to find those quite easily. I guess just to kind of close things out, I know we talked about writing advice and some different things like that, but if a person wants to write, what should they do?
Well, I think the first thing you do is become a reader, right? Yeah. All writers are readers at a certain level. If you're not reading, then that's the best way to learn, is to read widely and broadly and to read indiscriminately, right? Mm-hmm. Read really good books, read the classics, but then read crappy books too. Read stuff that's just you read just for fun, read stuff that you read because it's a challenge. Figure out what kind of a writer you want to be beyond that, right? Yeah. Once you've got that kind of stuff down, and continue to read. I mean, most writers I know they read like crazy still every day. Mm-hmm. But once you figure out what kind of writer you want to be and what kind of stories you want to tell, then sit down and start telling, right? Sit down and just lock yourself in a room, find a quiet place if you can, and start typing. And the real secret to it is that your first effort's going to probably suck. Right? It's just, it's the same way. Like if somebody told me I need to go build a bench or play or come up with a rock song or whatever. I would do an absolutely awful job my first time out, right? But you would learn. You learn every time you do these things. You learn by your mistakes. You say, okay, that part there didn't work, but this part I did well on. I'm going to try to shore up the parts I suck at and get better at the parts I'm good at. And so don't be afraid to suck. A lot of people, I think, they go, oh God, I'm just terrible, and then they give up, right? Or they go, oh God, I'm never gonna be able to show this to anybody. Well, here's the neat thing is you don't have to show it to anybody until you're comfortable with it, right?
Yeah.
Finish the book, polish it. Until you actually show it to somebody, it doesn't count. It can be awful, right? I know writers will sit down and say, they'll get to a point in a book and say, I don't know what happens next. They'll just say, come up with something cool, and then they'll move on to the next scene instead. And then, task their future self with coming up with a solution for the problem they just put in there. But try not to psych yourself out. Mike Stackpole is a guy who gave me some great advice about this many years ago. He said, instead of sitting down and trying to polish that first chapter to its just perfect, like a mirror sheen, move on. Write your second chapter, write your third chapter, write your fourth chapter. If a great idea comes to you for a previous chapter or something you're doing, just write a note in the margins and come back to it, right? Keep writing until you get to the end of the book. Because the trick is that by the time you get to the end of the book, you're probably going to have an idea that's going to change that first chapter anyway, right? You're going to have some other thing where you say, oh, geez, I need to fix that. And if you spend all that time polishing that chapter, two things happen. One is that you're reluctant to change it then because you put so much work into it. But the other thing is that all that time you spent on that, you could have been writing those other chapters, right? And it's much more efficient use of your time to just barf out that first draft, just get it out on paper however you can, or record it by on a voice recorder, or write it down by longhand or whatever it takes, just to get your first draft out there, and then you can go back and fix it, right? Because you can't fix something that's not there. You need to have something there first. You can't beat on it until it actually exists. So go out there and breathe some life into it, finish the project, and then go and do your second, your third, your fourth draft. And then if you get to the point where you're submitting stuff, turn that into an editor, show it to a friend, whatever you're doing there. Find an agent with it. But while you're doing that, go write your second book or your third book or your fourth book, right? You don't have to stop, and don't put all your hopes in that one basket. Because again, your first book is probably going to be terrible, right? And that's the way it is for most people. Now, the neat thing is that if you sell your fifth book, the editor will probably look to you and say, do you have anything else? And you'll say, oh, yeah, I've got 4 other books I haven't published yet, and here they are. And they'll say, well, this one kind of sucks, but you could fix it like this. You're like, well, we're off to the races now, because now I got 4 more books to do. Or you can say, screw it, those are trunk novels I never want the world to see, and burn them all and just move on to something new. But writing that stuff wasn't a waste, because it taught you how to get to the book that sold. Right?
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. My guest today has been Matt Forbeck. Matt, I will link up all of your products and things in the show notes so people can find your work and see what you're up to. And just thanks again. It was a great pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks again.
It was my honor. Thank you.
Okay, guys. I mean, wow. It was an absolute privilege to be able to talk to Matt Forbeck today. As I mentioned, I have provided links to his projects and novels and role-playing games in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. Do yourself a favor, check those out. As always, if you want free stuff, go to dicegeeks.com/free, and you will get 10 free dungeon maps to use in your campaigns. And also, if you want this show to continue, if you want me to interview more guests like Matt Forbeck, please visit my Patreon page, Patreon/DiceGeeks, and consider becoming a patron. I would greatly appreciate it, and you would help this show continue. So until next time, keep gaming.